Welcome to episode 3 of the Here We Go podcast. I'm your host, Trent Ging, and today we're going to talk about the wide receiver room. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, the wide receiver room is not the group that's the most intriguing to me, but it's one of the most popular subjects going around on social media right now among Steeler fans. So I thought, why not talk about where we are with the current state of the wide receiver room? What are some potential trade options, and what would that look like as far as compensation we'd have to give up, pay we'd have to give, and what is that going to look like long term? So I'm going to give my thoughts on some of these things. So let's dive right into it. The obvious statement of the year is that we have one established wide receiver on the roster. That's it. Now, George Pickens is going to undoubtedly be the number one, barring a major trade. But he's actually not proven he could be a number one. So no matter how you look at the current state of the wide receiver room, every position as it stands right now is going to be a question mark. I think a lot of people, myself included, think George can definitely develop into a number one. I think his production has been hurt by the terrible quarterback play and play calling from the last couple of years. So you expect him to take a real large leap forward this year and show that he is that game-breaking type guy who is going to be top 10 wide receiver in the NFL. He's got that potential. The question is, will his attitude and the sideline antics that he's had in the last year, will that get in his way? Has he matured a little bit in the offseason and grown up and understood that now you are the guy and the rest of the room is going to look to you to set an example? I certainly hope so. I don't think we're going to have an answer to that until we get into the season and see how things go, because the first sign of him not getting the ball, especially as the number one, what does that look like? Does he play through like he did toward the end of last year when Mason Rudolph was in the game and keep his head down and keep working and just keep doing what he's got to do to try to make an impact on the game? I certainly hope so. I think there's reason to be optimistic about it because we saw that at the end of last year, and he did seem to clean some of that stuff up. I mean, he had a game where he had 0 catches and 0 targets, I think, in the Baltimore game when the rain was coming down. And he didn't seem to really be distracted or really make any effort to have any kind of outburst. So I think we saw some progress there, and I think he's learned his lessons from the past. But it'll still be something to monitor as the season goes on this year. What do we have behind George? Well, to be honest with you, the cupboard's pretty bare. You have a guy who's coming in and Calvin Austin III, battling Van Jefferson and Quez Watkins for what would be the number 2 receiver currently. Of the group, Van Jefferson has had the most successful career. That's not saying a lot because it was 1 year with Matthew Stafford, who threw for a bunch of yards that year. He was still basically the number 3 outside of when Robert Woods got hurt. He did play a little bit in the number 2 role for a stretch there, but he was still primarily a third receiver. So I don't think you can consider him a lock to be the number 2. If you look into the OTA reporting, and I do see there is some value in what people are saying in OTAs, although you're not really kind of like lined up with the pads on and going one-on-one hard where you're tackling and everything. But like wide receivers and cornerbacks are probably the one group you can judge a little bit in shorts and a t-shirt, just because they're still going to play a lot of the same style without the pads on. Just not quite as physical. So it's good to hear positive reporting coming out of there. And so far, Van Jefferson sounds like he's been solid. Nothing great, but solid. Quez Watkins has gotten a lot of buzz. I don't believe there's any way that guy gets to be the number 2 on this roster unless he starts doing something crazy throughout minicamp and then once they get into Latrobe. He's a very one-dimensional guy, and that's okay. He can be a deep threat guy who maybe he makes this roster because he's also working to play special teams right now, which he's not done in the past. But if he can make an impact on special teams and he can be a one-dimensional deep threat guy that you can throw into the game to take the top off the defense, that's okay. Probably the guy that I find most intriguing is Calvin Austin III. There is a realistic path for him to both become the number 2 receiver or be cut. I mean, he is that wide open in this competition. There's people talking about he's really cleaned up his route running, that he's looking to use a little bit more tempo in his route running and changing his tempo in his route running to utilize some of that speed and keep defenders off balance. If he really uses that effectively and starts learning to get separation, that would be big for him. Because for a guy who was a speedster and very quick, not just top end speed fast, but also very, very good quickness, very shifty, he didn't get any separation last year, which was very disappointing from my standpoint because I tend to root for the underdog and undersized guys. So I was hoping to see real development from him last year, and we just did not see that. The things that were talked about during the NFL draft were issues for him in the season. He didn't get great separation because he's not a great route runner, and he doesn't catch the ball away from his frame well. We saw both of those things come into fruition during last season. I mean, there was, a stretch where Cincinnati's defense, I remember, he really struggled to get open. Ran some comeback routes that, a guy with his speed, you should be able to really sell the deep threat in a fly route and then hit the stop button basically and turn, come back a couple yards and make a catch. He didn't do that. And that's a lack of knowledge of route running because he really basically hit, stop, turn, and the ball was coming at him, and he did not work his way back to the ball. He waited on it, and then the defender had plenty of time to knock it away or make it a challenging catch, and he just didn't pull it in. And when you see things like that, you hope that he took some notes from that, and that's what he really worked on in the offseason. It sounds as though he did, but again, it's football in shorts. You're not going to get a ton of negative reporting right now. And that's just the reality of it. Everybody's excited for the season to start. We're still months away, so the reporting is going to be a little bit blown out of proportion. But it is nice to hear if he has cleaned up his route running and he is starting to get a little bit of separation right now. You hope to see that carry over until we start putting the pads on and see once these corners can really put their hands on him. He's a very undersized guy. He's only 172 pounds. So even if he does work his way into being a better route runner and actually a threat all over the field instead of just being a deep threat like what he was last year or a gimmick play guy, I wonder about what his blocking is going to look like. At 172 pounds, most corners are going to have a minimum of 10 pounds on him. So that'll be an interesting storyline for me because I don't know that he's a lock to return punts. That's another role Quez Watkins could look to take over. So there's no sure thing there, which is why I think it's a very realistic possibility that you could see Calvin Austin III be the number 2 or cut. He's the one that's the most intriguing to me. Roman Wilson is the guy who I think is a lock to make the roster. The only other receiver that's a lock to make the roster because we invested that 3rd round pick in him. He's going to be on the roster and he's going to play. Could he theoretically become the number two? He could. I just don't think he will. Not this year. First of all, I don't like the idea of putting a rookie in the situation where he has to fill that kind of a significant role. Now, I still think he will have a significant role, but it's going to be out of the slot. He was a slot guy in college. He was very effective in that role. He's very comfortable in that role. He's a guy who's actually a little bigger than I thought he was, about 190, 192 pounds. I actually thought he was a little slimmer. I thought he was in the 180s, which is intriguing because everybody talks about him not being able to get off the line of scrimmage. I actually think he's built a little more solidly than people give him credit for, but he really hasn't had to do that very often in his career. So maybe from my standpoint, that's where you just want to see it before you believe it. At Michigan, he really had a lot of motions where they would move him around to kind of get him going into his routes quickly. And that's probably a similar role that he's going to fill here in Pittsburgh. I see him starting out in the slot. He's built very similar to Deontay Johnson, actually. So he could develop into the number two receiver. I just don't think it's going to be this year. There's reports of him actually struggling in OTAs, which is expected for a rookie, especially a third rounder. And typically when you invest third round capital into a guy, you don't expect him to start week one. You expect him to be a little bit developmental. And that's exactly what Roman Wilson's going to be. It's going to be a developmental piece the team's going to utilize in the slot. He will have a significant impact and a significant role as that slot receiver. But I don't know that he's going to challenge for the number two spot right now. I mean, we'll see. Like I said, theoretically, it's not out of the picture. But I don't know that the team, especially the way that Mike Tomlin runs the ship, he's not going to want to thrust another rookie into a starting role, especially week one. You're already going to have that likely with your offensive line that I'll talk about in a following episode. So it's a pretty wide open competition, but you just don't have proven commodities in this wide receiver room right now. A guy like a Dez Fitzpatrick could make the team. I don't think he challenges for the number two role at wide receiver. And to be perfectly honest with you, Pat Freiermuth is really going to be your number two receiver. He just doesn't play the wide receiver position. But he will be second in target share, especially the way that Arthur Smith runs his offense and the way he likes to utilize that tight end position. They're talking about him moving around as a move tight end. So I think he's going to be your number two receiver. And whoever is the number two really is only going to be the number two on paper. Again, barring a big trade. So talking of trades, let's talk about what the trade could look like. The man that everybody has up in the air is Brandon Aiyuk. I have completely talked myself out of Brandon Aiyuk. Now, let me say this. He is a fantastic player. He is a very good receiver. And if he came here, he will be your number one, not your number two. And George Pickens moves back to the number two role. The problem with Brandon Aiyuk is that you have to give up a second-round draft pick, most likely, to get that guy. And you're going to have to pay him around $30 million to make him happy. There's a report that San Francisco offered him 26. They've not really moved off that offer. He's not happy with that. He sees the deals that have been made. And I think the Amon-Ra St. Brown contract is going to be the one that he looks at to say, I need $30 million if that guy's getting it. And he deserves it, quite honestly. He finished very highly in a lot of statistical categories last season. And I think he's been San Francisco's wide receiver one now for a couple of seasons. Deebo gets a lot of attention because of his versatility. But Aiyuk is the better route runner. He's the guy that you can rely on in third down situations to get you, to get open and get you that first down, move the sticks, and keep you on rhythm with the offense. So I really, really, really like Brandon Ayuk, but I just don't think he makes sense for this team. We're not one player away from the Super Bowl, in my opinion. So bringing a guy in like Brandon Ayuk really is going to cost you a second round pick next year, which you're desperately going to need because you're building a roster right now, and it's not completed. You're going to need that second round pick, but then on top of that, you're going to invest $30 million into a wide receiver position, and have another guy who's going to expect to get paid in George Pickens coming up right behind that. I think if you brought in Ayuk, you pay him, it is basically spelling the end for George Pickens in Pittsburgh because we're not a two-contract team historically. So if you pay one, you can probably bet this team is not going to pay two. Omar Khan has been doing things a little differently. I could be completely wrong on that, but the path to keep both guys is going to be very slim. And I just don't think it's going to happen. So I really like Ayuk, and I think he's a fantastic player. I'd love to have him here, but I just don't think it makes sense for this roster. If you could pry a guy like Courtland Sutton out of Denver, who's a good player, who will come in, he will be your number two. George will still be your number one. He would come at a much, much significantly less asking price than a Brandon Ayuk would. And the trade value would be significantly less. I think you could probably bring in Courtland Sutton for a fourth-round pick. And honestly, I think you could pay both George Pickens and Courtland Sutton with the current makeup of this roster. So that to me seems to make a little bit more sense. I don't know if Denver's going to be willing to part ways with Sutton. I don't know what Sutton's going to really think about his contract situation as camp, starts out and then he starts showing up and get around your teammates. Does it change your mind? Does he stay a little bit disgruntled where he's not getting what he wants in a contract situation? It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. All reports so far indicate that he's not going to be available, but I think a player like him would make the most sense if you could get a guy like that. And the only other trade option is a guy that just nobody knows that's on the market right now. Omar Khan's going to be hammering the phones. You know that. He's going to want to increase production out of that wide receiver room and give them a better look than what we have right now. So I do think he's going to try to make a deal. The question is, can he make a deal? Is anybody else going to be willing to do the deal with him? So I think the most likely scenario is he is going to make a run at Brandon Ayuk. I don't know that a deal gets done, but it sounds as though they were pretty much a done deal at the draft. So does that mean we can get one done now? Not necessarily, but the longer this situation continues to grow and sour in San Francisco, the more likely a trade like that for Ayuk could happen. So it'll be really interesting to see how this thing plays out. But I don't like our wide receiver room as it stands right now. You have one proven commodity, and he's proven as a number two, not a number one. I think that it'll be interesting to watch once camp rolls around and they get the pads on. They're in Latrobe. Tomlin likes to run physical practices. Let's see if some of these undersized guys, like Calvin Austin III, can handle it and give himself a realistic shot to be the wide receiver too. And if he really proves himself, that eliminates the need to make a trade. I think that would be best case scenario for this team because then you feel comfortable paying George next year and you don't have a $30 million receiver on your payroll because you're still going to need to find a quarterback to pay. So I think that's where we're at. It's going to be interesting to see how this thing plays out. I hope you guys enjoy the content. If you do, please like, share, leave comments below. I welcome all feedback, and I appreciate you watching. Thank you. Have a good day.